Have you ever wondered if the line between what's physically possible and what's a miracle is actually a lot blurrier than we think? Well, today, we're diving into this incredible intersection where quantum mechanics and ancient Buddhist wisdom seem to be pointing at the very same, very strange reality. A reality where the impossible might just be really, really improbable. And it all kicks off with this wild question: can a person actually walk through a solid wall? I know, it sounds like something straight out of a superhero movie. But what if the rule book that we think governs reality is missing a few really important pages? So, to dig into this, we're going to use two very different but incredibly powerful toolkits. On one hand, you've got modern physics. It maps our world from the outside in using the precise language of mathematics. And on the other hand, you have Buddhist wisdom, which maps reality from the inside out through deep, systematic meditation. And as you're about to see, it is shocking how similar their maps are starting to look. Okay, first things first, let's talk about the wall itself. The problem of the wall. In our everyday lives, what we'd call the classical view, a wall is pretty much the definition of solid. It's an impenetrable barrier, an absolute nope, you can't pass. Simple, right? And yeah, our common sense view is totally backed up by classical physics. Just picture a tennis ball hitting a brick wall. If you don't throw it hard enough to smash right through it, it just bounces back. Every single time. There's zero ambiguity there. But as science started to dig deeper, it found that underneath the surface level reality, things get a whole lot weirder. Because here's the twist. It turns out that both quantum physics and Buddhist philosophy offer a way to completely dismantle this idea of solidity. They give us two totally distinct yet weirdly similar paths to get right through that wall. The first path is something called quantum tunneling. See, down at the tiny subatomic level, barriers aren't absolute. A particle, say an electron, doesn't actually need enough energy to blast through a barrier. Instead, there's a small but very, very real probability that it can just pop up on the other side. It tunnels through a region that, according to classical physics, should be totally forbidden. And get this isn't some wacky abstract theory. Quantum tunneling is essential to how our universe works. It's how those high-tech scanning tunneling microscopes let us see individual atoms. But even more amazing, it's how protons manage to fuse together inside the sun, creating all the energy that makes life on Earth possible. Seriously, without tunneling, our sun just wouldn't shine. Okay, now let's switch gears. Thousands of years before we even conceived of quantum mechanics, Buddhist Abhidhamma philosophy was deconstructing matter in a way that sounds strangely familiar. It teaches that what we see as solid objects are really just made of these tiny, flickering clusters of energy. They call them kalapas. And the crucial part? These kalapas are themselves mostly just empty space. And the Abhidhamma goes even deeper. It defines the classical elements, earth, water, fire, wind, not as substances, but as fundamental forces. And this leads to an incredible insight. When you touch a wall, you're not actually making contact with solid matter. What you're experiencing is the Patavi element, the force of repulsion. What we call solidity is just our brain's interpretation of a force field pushing back. So let's connect the dots. If the wall isn't really solid, but is actually a probabilistic field of forces and a whole lot of empty space, then what could possibly operate on that field? Well, this is where the mind enters the picture. You see, ancient Buddhist texts talk about these powers called Iddhi, which are said to be developed through years of intense meditation. And one of them is the ability to do exactly what we asked at the beginning, to pass through a wall as if it were just empty space. But how? Is it some kind of magic? Well, the text suggests it's actually more like a highly advanced cognitive technique. In fact, a classic meditation manual called the Visuddhimagga literally lays out the instructions. Step 1, achieve a state of profound concentration. Then, from that state, the meditator actively deconstructs their perception of the wall. They stop seeing it as a solid thing and start seeing it for what it truly is, a shimmering collection of forces and voids. The key step is a cognitive override, a powerful, deliberate mental decision to perceive that wall as space. And that final act is what is said to actualize the potential. So, from this perspective, the meditator isn't breaking the laws of physics, not at all. They're using a highly trained consciousness to interact with reality at its most basic, probabilistic level. It's kind of like a radio tuned to static. All the potential stations exist at once in that noise. The meditator is basically learning how to expertly turn the dial to collapse the wave function and tune into one very specific, very low probability station. All right, now let's zoom way out. If a focused mind can influence a single event like that, what does that imply for the whole stream of cause and effect in our lives? This brings us to a really fascinating parallel between the ancient concept of karma and the supermodern science of quantum computing. So a quantum bit, a qubit, can be both a 0 and a 1 at the same time. It's called a state of superposition. This is what lets a quantum computer process all possible outcomes at once. Well, Buddhist philosophy describes our karmic potential in a very similar way, that we exist in a superposition of all possible futures, and all our past actions exist as seeds of potential. So how does one specific outcome pop out of all that potential? Well, a quantum computer uses a process called interference to basically amplify the probability of the right answer while canceling out all the wrong ones. And in the Buddhist model of karma, a similar thing happens. When the conditions are just right, one of those potential futures ripens and becomes our actual experienced reality. And this metaphor just works so well. Wholesome actions, or merit, you could see those as creating constructive interference, boosting the potential for positive outcomes. And unwholesome actions, they create destructive interference, canceling out those positive potentials and leading to negative results instead. It's a pretty powerful way to think about cause and effect, isn't it? Okay, so after that mind-bending journey, what's the bottom line? Let's break it down. Takeaway number 1, the solid world we all take for granted is basically just a very persistent, high-probability illusion. 2, if that's true, then the barriers we see aren't absolute brick walls. They're just fields of probability. And 3, which might be the most profound of all, the base layer of reality isn't made of solid things. It's made of pure, shimmering potential. And this brings us right back to our 2 maps of reality. Physics uses the language of math to describe this web of potential from the outside. Buddhism uses the finely tuned instrument of the meditative mind to explore it from the inside. And it's totally possible they are describing the exact same reality, just using 2 very different languages. Which leaves us with one last huge question to chew on. For centuries, physics has been describing a universe of matter and energy. But what if there's a missing piece to the puzzle? Is it possible that consciousness isn't just a random byproduct of the system, but is actually a fundamental variable in the equation that shapes reality itself? Definitely something to think about.